This is the Definitely Uncertain podcast, brought to you by Goldrock Capital. Each week, we look at how high net worth families can improve their lives, decisions, and investments in a deeply uncertain world. We always aim to provide practical information, even if we can't offer specific investment advice.
Welcome again to Definitely Uncertain, the Goldrock podcast. And today we have the privilege of having with us Joanna Landau. Joanna Landau is an entrepreneur who has been involved in multiple social startups and various NGOs, which obviously we're going to talk about a little bit more. Like myself, she has roots in the United Kingdom, Britain. And so we probably share things like tea and various other very important matters. But today we're going to focus a little bit on the work that Joanna's been doing over many years with Vibe and really branding Israel and taking the message of Israel out to an international audience. And also, of course, the fact that Joanna has chosen to go down the route of philanthropy rather than working in the private sector, which she absolutely could do with her legal qualifications and so forth. Talented as Joanna is. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. So let's get straight into it. First of all, welcome Joanna onto the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And I thought maybe the place that we could start from and then sort of gradually work through is talk a little bit about your decision to dedicate yourself to the world of not-for-profits and sort of make that your focus in life. Where does that come from? Why have you chosen that? You clearly could have done other things. So maybe we can start from there.
Sure. So I come from fourth generation philanthropic family. So it was part of my upbringing. It was always around, but I did not choose to go there right from the beginning. My first choice, I went to study law at Cambridge and I came back to Israel and became a lawyer. I likely would have stayed in the field, except that I did not feel that I wanted to do the law so much as I wanted to do the business. Mm-hmm. So then I went into business. All the while, of course, I was involved in various philanthropic efforts and initiatives that the family was doing, but it was never the focal point. But I always did know that eventually I would have to get much more involved. And I was, the next in line. So I was clearly going to have to be involved in my family foundation and so on. But my life was going ahead as planned. I got married. I had 3 kids. And when my youngest was 1.5 years and my oldest was 5, which was about 13, 14 years ago, I was 35. I woke up in the morning and I basically just said, it can't be that I had a business at the time and my business was fine. It was I wanted to import the idea of digital photo books to Israel at a time when it didn't exist. I was ordering photo books of my children and family and so on from the United States, and the delivery cost more than the actual book. Mm-hmm. And so I thought we really should have it in Israel. And I had a company called Say Cheese and I was working on it. Fine. It was all good. I was happily married. I had 3 kids. Everything was great, except that I didn't feel that I was really having a meaningful impact on my life, the life around me. And of course, seeing that as part of my life, I felt that I wanted to get involved in it. And I woke up in the morning and I just sort of said, I want to do more. And I actually chose to go through a little bit of coaching and figure out the sentence that I said to myself was, I know I'm a passionate person, but I don't know what I'm passionate about. I know I have the skill sets, I know I have the capabilities, and I'm very fortunate to have the means, but what am I going to do with it? So I did a process. It took me 2 months. I'm quite goal-oriented, and I understood that my greatest concern and that my need to sort of change was not in the for-profit world. It wasn't about making money, and it wasn't, at the time, there wasn't really social companies. There wasn't social enterprises so much. It was, you're either in philanthropy or you're in business. And I discovered that I was more moved by making a difference socially than I was by, striking a good deal. And then I found what was interesting to me and what my biggest concern was, and I decided to implement business thinking, but in a nonprofit world. That's how I got into it.
And when you sort of joined, when you sort of set that up or got involved in that, you talk about bringing business thinking to not-for-profits. That was reasonably early, back the end of the last century, the beginning of this. It was still about tea and sandwiches and meeting some friends and doing some good. And
right.
if something comes out of it, that'll be fine. Did you find that to be, you're a slightly strange a strange fish in the pond at that point?
I mean, I was certainly strange fish in the pond where it comes to British style philanthropy, which can be strategic, but most of it is fairly based on a patriarch or a matriarch and what they wanted originally, and then the children just follow suit. And all the skill sets and knowledge that you have when doing business somehow disappear, and then it all becomes very emotional, and you seem to be making all sorts of decisions which, if it were money that you were investing, the question was, are you getting a return on the investment that you wanted? And that wasn't really a conversation that I was familiar with in the philanthropic world. Eventually, I came to learn that, for example, in the American philanthropic world, especially in the Jewish philanthropic world, it's extremely advanced. And I'm not sure that I would say that 10 years ago, there wasn't strategic sort of business style thinking in the nonprofit world. But certainly the world that I knew, Israel and England, I didn't see any application. What I saw was what my family was doing, which was always great stuff and amazing things. But I am naturally oriented to be data-driven. My mind, I could have remained a lawyer. I'm very rational in my thinking.
Sure.
I'm very goal-oriented, as I mentioned. So it just made sense for me to apply it in the nonprofit world. And I should also note that being the sort of, the next one in line, I didn't have this huge foundation that I was managing enormous amounts of money that I could, really do whatever I wanted. I had a smaller amount of money. And so I wanted more bang for my buck. And so I felt that to do that, I should really just borrow methodologies from the commercial world and implement them. It seemed to make sense to me at the time. I think with hindsight, it was the right way to go.
Right. It is reasonably de rigueur these days in almost across the board in I would say, serious philanthropy.
Yes.
You mentioned the difference between sort of the American style philanthropy and foundations and the UK style of foundations. I think also there's another aspect of that, which we talked about a little bit prior to this, which is this sense or the mechanism that is more prevalent in the US about getting the next generation involved is different in the US to the UK. I really like your perspective on that. As you've been now in the philanthropic world for a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
Maybe share with us what you saw as two very different modes, and if you can, if you've got any views which you think may work, or what are the advantages of either.
Well, I find it fascinating to look on the sidelines and at both of the sort of options. And again, the options that I'm looking at is a very strategic, families gather, like in the United States, they're big families, they're spread across a large area. Mm-hmm. Once a year, they gather together, they do a retreat, they have someone facilitating it, they bring the grandchildren. The grandchildren know that when they're 18 or 16 or 13 or 25, they get on the board and the trust or whatever it is, and they're involved, right? And the grandparents sort of literally pass the torch on, which all sounds wonderful, but behind the scenes, of course, the grandparents really would like to dictate where it's going to go. And there's a huge amount of frustration internally, as with everything. Mm-hmm. Same with family businesses. You pretend to pass it on, but you really would like them to keep the same.
I'm happy to give you control as long as you do what I want.
Exactly. So yep. I wouldn't say that is better than what I was used to, where, there was a vision. In my case, there were, both my grandparents, one of them went in one direction and the other went in the other direction in terms of areas where they wanted to influence, but they were both mutually supported and very big visions, which then continued. And I'll give an example for my own. My grandmother is her big vision and her big sense of wanting to make a real change is in the field of the environment and climate change and so on. She was very early on recognized. She's sort of the older version of Greta Thunberg.
There's an interesting mental vision for us, yes.
But it didn't move me honestly. I wasn't that particularly interested, and I would do it because I wanted to continue my grandmother's still alive, but I'll do it because I want to continue my grandmother's legacy.
Sure.
Over time, of course, you develop your own desires and your own needs and what you want to do. So when it's very structured, then I think it's too much in one direction because it's all very organized, and maybe there's too much supervision and there are too many people telling you what to do, kind of thing, and advisors and so on, that the grandparents are sort of checking. And on the other hand, when there's sort of a rather more open book sort of policy, then there's more room for conversation, room to develop your areas of interest and so on, but not enough guidance. Mm-hmm. So I would say somewhere in the middle, and absolutely 100%. I really do feel that a charitable investment is no different to a business investment. You know, if you wouldn't invest in this share today, then you should be selling it.
Yep.
Right. And so if you wouldn't invest in this NGO that you've supported for 40 years because you see they're no longer really achieving the result, then you really should stop investing in it. But people don't. They stay loyal for years. And it's wonderful, except that it keeps lots of organizations going that are not really impacting socially the way that they should. So I would say it's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point, which is obviously the amount of capital available for philanthropy and social investing, if you will, is not an unlimited resource. And if we're investing it in inefficient or out of date organizations, effectively we're restricting capital to go to a more innovative, innovative and groundbreaking initiatives. Finding that balance is obviously a little bit like in companies. It's always a hard balance to find.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be innovative or groundbreaking compared to what has been done before. It could be the same thing exactly, so long as it's creating the impact.
Right.
That's the problem. The problem is if you're still investing in something, a charity that you've always loved and your grandparents loved or your parents loved or whatever it is, and you do too, but you see that times have changed and leadership has changed and the needs of the market of that charitable organization have changed, but the organization has not changed with it, then you have to think about it. And
I have seen in some extreme circumstances where multi-generational family foundations have been set up in a way where effectively if Fred gave to Bob 40 years ago because they sat next together in shul or he happened to meet him once at a meeting, the mandate is basically to continue that forever. Mm-hmm. And as you say, there is a certain sentiment around part of these things. And I think the ability to carry some level of those traditions and values forward are really important. But as you say, just because that's what was done in 1964 probably doesn't necessarily mean it's relevant in 2024.
Yeah. And then you have the other side of the coin where you've got somebody who knows that, it's not necessarily the way things are won't always be. And then you've got mainly, I think, American charities, but maybe foundations, maybe they're in other places, but they do sunsetting in the sense that they just close down the foundation after a certain amount of years. Right. And maybe that's a shame as well, because maybe they're having an enormous amount of impact, but that's what the people decided and the trustees will go ahead and do it. Yeah. So somewhere in
there are a lot of different models. Let's jump in a little bit to Vibe, which is really where you've spent a great deal of, all of your professional time over the last sort of decade or so. Yeah. Before we get into where it's at right now, just tell us a little bit about why it was set up and what its main sort of mission statement looks like.
So going back to what I said at the beginning, I woke up in the morning and I said, what really concerns me? What change do I want to see in the world? And I went through a whole list. And eventually I got to the point where what I understood that concerns me the most is that the world's perception of the country that I live in, Israel, is vastly different to my experience of living in this country. So what the world was seeing in the media and so on, and what the conversations were about Israel globally was the conflict and that it was the Jewish homeland. And what I was experiencing was, of course, we listen to the news every day on the hour, and it's always around us. And yes, we're Jewish, but we also are people with some of us with mortgages and, children who are sending their kids to school, and we have businesses and we have culture and art and everything. It's a country. It's not a conflict. And that gap seemed to me, I couldn't find what explained the gap, because until that point, the understanding was the way to bridge the gap between perception and reality when it comes to Israel is to do advocacy work and to explain to people Israel's policies, and then they will understand, and then they will change their mind. And to me, it wasn't an advocacy issue. I don't feel I have to support the government of another country in order to feel emotionally connected. To me, I felt that the problem was that people just didn't know who we are, what we're about. There's so many amazing things, but these stories were not being told. And so I felt that there's this gap between perception and reality, and I thought I want to get over it. And I won't go into the whole detail of how I did it, but basically, in the end, I established a nonprofit called Vibe Israel. And we are basically experts in branding and marketing Israel. So if you will, imagine a supermarket, and you're walking into the supermarket. You're not there to buy toothpaste or bread or anything like that. You're there to buy your next vacation, a business that you want to invest in, where you're going to send your kids to an MBA degree, what cultural sort of experience you'd like to have today, what you're going to watch on Netflix, so on and so forth. These are all products that companies are selling in the supermarket, which immediately explains to you that we live in a competitive world. So no matter how much you think of one country, how great they are or how bad they are, you've always got alternatives to choose from. And being the field of branding and marketing a country is really about making that country the most appealing to the target audience. Very similar, as we talked about philanthropy, taking commercial methodologies about brands and companies and applying them to places. So that's what we do. This is who we are. We focus on that field. And what we make sure is that the world knows these stories that are relevant to them about Israel. Mainly, our focus has been in the last decade on the culture and the lifestyle of Israel, because we noticed that a big part of the problem is this next generation, millennials, Gen Z. They're far less interested in having a conversation about the conflict, but they're very interested in music, design, business, whatever it is that tickles their fancy. Israel has a lot to offer. Mm-hmm. And so we focused on doing that. Our flagship project has been tours that we arrange for online influencers in Israel, people who write about topics like food and so on, or education. And they've got a huge following online. And we bring them to Israel for a week and show them what Israel has to offer. And then they write amazing posts and blog articles about it, or vlogs. And we've generated over 1 billion positive mentions of Israel online as a result.
That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. And in the last couple of years, we've really extended our connection and our work into the field of promoting Israel as a business partner, working with the Jewish community outside of Israel. How do you tell Israel's story to your next generation? Mm-hmm. So just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you're connected to Israel. And certainly the next generation is feeling that disconnect much more. So how do you tell Israel's story in a way that brings them back? And that's basically what we do.
So talking about that for a second, we have been branded very much as the sort of high-tech nation, the startup nation. We talked about this earlier, and you had some insights about that. And again, really very much sort of bringing more of a business analysis to this than what would classically be involved in advocacy. Are we still the startup nation?
So we wanted to find that out. And
by the way, I heard a new one this week. We're not startup nation. We're now vaccination.
Yes, you heard it from me.
Oh, there we go. Brilliant. I have my sources, you see.
Yeah, absolutely justified. No, again, as you said, if you want to define what a country's brand is about, it's very similar to defining what a company or a product brand is all about. So the first thing you have to do is define your target market and then understand what the target market currently thinks of you. the sort of a situational analysis. So we did a situational analysis of the current brand of Israel when it comes to business, which is Startup Nation.
Yep.
As far as we're concerned, that's what we're selling the world. We interviewed, we did an online survey of 3,000 business decision makers around the world in 10 locations where Israel has got a lot of business going on. We based that research off of internal research that we did amongst the leadership of the business community here in Israel and government representatives, and a survey amongst economic attachés and diplomats and so on, based around the world. And we discovered that while we think Israel is the startup nation, and practically speaking, it certainly is, there's a big difference between the facts and the perception. So the world, maybe 10 years ago when the book Startup Nation came out, it made a huge splash. It was tremendously successful. It was a brilliant, successful message, which has a shelf life. And we're at the end of that shelf life in the sense that we still think that it's very impactful and that the world associates Israel with the term Startup Nation. We still think that we're the ones, we're in this blue ocean, we're the best at technology. Look at our numbers, look at Bloomberg, whatever, innovation index, so on, and all the unicorns. But the world, business people, did not necessarily associate Israel as the leader in technology or as the startup nation. So we asked, for example, what's your first association when we say the word Israel? And, you'd expect to see the word startups if we're the startup nation. And out of 3,000 people, 26 people said startups. So less than 1%, which is mind-boggling. And you ask yourself, how come? We also looked online for searches for the term startup nation and Israel. So we looked for the term startup nation in general, and then we looked for the term startup nation and Israel. And if you look for the term startup nation France or startup nation Romania or Germany or so on and so forth, you will find other countries are using this, lack of a better word, slogan, startup nation, and it's become really generic, okay? And there's even an EU startup nation standard of how do you become an innovative ecosystem as a country in order to encourage EU countries to become more technologically advanced. And that means that we were tremendously successful, but now we've given away our brand equity to other countries. And we are saying startup nation, but most people, as a result, the business people, are not necessarily associating that with Israel. They are fully aware of Israeli technology. Business people, of course, respect Israel for the technology and so on. But again, it's been 10 years since the book came out. Mm-hmm. And in those 10 years, maybe due to the success of Israel, many other countries have decided to invest in being better at technology. Small countries like Israel that are dependent on foreign direct investment, dependent on international trade, whether it's Finland, Estonia, South Korea, Singapore, all these different countries are now actually really good at technology as well. And so I take you back into the supermarket. Yep. On the shelf, we're not on our own anymore. And then it comes to, okay, who's better at marketing themselves? If you've got two technologies which are the same, yep, maybe ours is better, but am I as good at marketing? The answer that we found, and we are working with the sort of the McKinsey of the field of country branding that work with many other countries and cities around the world, is that our marketing is not as good as other countries because there's no strategic investment in it from a government level.
So this is going to be something Vibe is involved with, advocating for?
Yes, as I mentioned before, we were more focused on the cultural and lifestyle aspect of Israel. Now we are in conversation with the Ministry of Economy to discuss how we can work together on really creating much more strategic efforts to brand and market Israel. And in a sense, it's really to emulate what happened 10 years ago with Startup Nation. The book was not just a book. There was a book, and then there was Dan Senor and Saul Singer, the authors, who actually were interviewed. Dan Senor was interviewed on CBS and on many different platforms, giving sort of the cliff notes of the book. And then it was translated into many different languages. And you had all the Jewish diaspora who were giving the book around. And you had all the diplomats who were giving the book around, the Israeli diplomats. And that was a distribution platform which was suitable for 10 years ago.
Yep.
It grew organically, tremendously successfully, but I would define it more like biz dev than marketing, right? And what Israel needs is really to emulate that success in the third decade of the 21st century, but in a way that recognizes that we now have social media, we now have virtual experiences, we have a lot of ability. People are traveling much more globally than they did. There are so many things that can be done, and we have an entire work plan to implement that.
All right, good luck with that. One final thing I thought maybe we'd have a chat about, and a lot of organizations, particularly in the not-for-profit world, have had to sort of cope with this. We're almost a year into the sort of pandemic and COVID, et cetera. And many NGOs sort of woke up and realized that what they had done previously, their core business or their core activity, suddenly became irrelevant. And obviously, where Vibe was concerned, suddenly bringing influence and so forth to Israel to see Israel physically, that was no longer going to be relevant, at least for a period of time. So I'd like to talk just for a few minutes about the pivot. What was the moment that you sort of realized we're going to have to do something? How quickly did you realize that it wasn't just going to be a quick fix for a number of weeks, but something which is going to carry with us for a number of time? And sort of bringing us to where we are right now, as you look forward, what do you think has sort of been developed out of that could be of use to you even when the pandemic is over?
Sure. So if we go back a year, right? So for Israel, it kind of around February we understood that there's a problem. We had our last tour last year was in February. We usually do about 8 tours a year. So we had a whole year planned. Everything was fine, going great. And then, of course, we had to stop. So initially, the first reaction, it was the natural reaction. You first kind of freeze, and then you kind of try and figure it out. And then you either sort of go down or go up. It's like those are the choices. So very initially, we thought, okay, let's try and use what we have and all the influencers that we have connections with and do a lot of virtual sort of experiences with them. We tried it out. We didn't feel it was very impactful. It didn't seem to work that well. You're familiar with the world of influencers, they really need to experience something in order to be able to tell a great story. And just having conversations and talking heads was just not enough. So right from the start, we were like, okay, we tried something out within the same sort of space that we're in, but that wasn't quite working. And then you've got an option to sort of adopt what I call the wait and see strategy, which is what a lot of trip providers to Israel have done. And so they're just waiting for it to sort of pass, and then we go back. But that's not the way I'm sort of made.
It's and not the Joanna style, I don't think.
Not something I'm capable of, apparently. And so we started to think differently. And of course, we were in lockdown. And so there wasn't really much we could do. During the period of lockdown, which was over Passover and so on, I felt that we had to do something. So we actually did a global campaign to really share a message of hope about the pandemic, where everybody was in the house. It was very heart-wrenching. People were dying. It was terrible. And we really felt that we needed to do something. So we created a short 2-minute campaign called The Promise, where we took pieces of online content and put them all together into a very uplifting piece, sort of a campaign, which reached over 1 million people globally. And what it was it was still in line with who we are and what we're about. So it was all about how countries are now being sort of, it's like people, the Italians were singing on the balconies because they're Italian. You're not going to see Germans singing on the balconies, right? And you've got the NHS and the British people were clapping very politely. That's the whole. And Israel, you see the soldiers and, helping. And there was something about that I felt was very meaningful. And we put Israel into the clips as well. And so it was a very subtle message. It really, I think I needed it for my own personal ability to continue. And so we did that. And I had a lot of, energy spent on that. Meanwhile, we're thinking, what the hell do we do now? Because we can't do tours. First of all, so the first initial stage was, let's put off the amounts that we had saved for our tours to 2 months, maybe 3 months, and each time keep it in the kitty and move it forward, which meant that eventually you're going to run out of money for your everyday costs. I had to let one of the people go. Slowly, we're sort of seeing what are we capable of doing. And at some point, we were having this internal conversation. I think it was probably around June, where I just felt that the lack of certainty of when this thing was going to be over was so disconcerting that it wasn't giving us the ability to pivot. And so I just said, you know what? Let's just decide that we're not going to do tours until the fall of 2021. I don't foresee tours coming back before the summer. We don't do tours in the summer because it's too hot and no one's around. So the earliest we could do a tour was September. Instead of having this sort of let's push it off by a month or two.
So in a way, what you did was you took control of the lack of certainty by saying, actually, we're just going to push it all the way out. And in a certain way, I mean, during that period, the thing which was particularly disconcerting was the fact not only was everything uncertain, but we weren't even sure what we were uncertain about. Right. So you had this kind of multiple layer of, I'd have no, business tool or rationale to make any sorts of decisions. So one of the things it seems that you've done is to say, let's take the uncertainty about it and just say, we'll knock it straight out of the park. And
I think
that gave you certainty about we're not going to do that.
Exactly. So it gave me some sense of control over completely. I mean, to this day, we don't really know what's going on, right? Yep. But it gave me something. It opened up the space. At that point, we started thinking, okay, what are we good at? We're good at doing these trips to influencers, and we're good at telling Israel's story. So we understood that we can't work with one target market, which is these influencers. We maintain a relationship with them, but we can't resume the tours yet. So what other target markets are there? And we discovered the Jewish community outside of Israel that was really seeking really high quality virtual content that was not available because there are so many trips to Israel in such an organized manner. And so we thought, well, we know how to do trips. We'll just adapt them to the online sort of platform. And so that's what we did. We took our trips and we sort of thought of how do we do it in a way which is really quite unique. And we're developing an app and it's kind of gamification and the whole load of things. And at the time, it started as a temporary product to replace the fact that we can't bring people. But of course, right from the beginning, it was clear to me that this is a potential to become a brand new product offering by Vibe Israel, this time to the Jewish community who wants to engage their next generation. And we're now at that stage. We're doing a pilot with the School for Shlichim, and we've got various foundations around the world who are working with us. So it definitely sort of just by power of inertia and the refusal to accept that we just wait and let the world control it for us, we came up with something which, yes, we can use it for 6 months and let it go and go back to our tours. But in fact, we've just created a whole new target market, which is the Jewish community. So that was one thing. Started working on that. Another thing that we did was that we started to work with the Jewish community. How do you tell the story? Lots of Jewish professionals who are working with the next generation, all these online boring Zooms, whatever. What are you talking about when you talk about Israel? You can't talk about Ben Gurion and Golda Meir anymore. You have to do something fairly updated, and you have to understand the next generation to do that. And we specialize in that. So now we work with federations and so on to sort of help them tell the story onwards. And the third thing that happened was very much what I call a Corona product. I got a phone call from the chairman of the Export Institute back in March. And he said to me, I'm very concerned about Israel's exports because of Corona. The whole world is coming to a stop. What are we going to do? And in the end, it's not, we really need to get the big countries, the really large states that have large economies, they will become inward looking. They have large enough populations. And so they are not that bothered, or of course they're bothered, but it's not as bad for them. But small countries like us are really going to need to get better at our marketing because all the other small countries are going to get better at it. And they've got proper strategic programs in place in their governments for several years now, and Israel doesn't. So he said to me, I think that Vibe can help business people sort of share the story better. And he connected me with someone in the Ministry of Economy, and that's where it all started. And I felt, going back to the beginning of our conversation, that if we're going to do this, let's do it right. And I went back to our consultants and I said, we want to look at how business people are viewing Israel and how we can bridge that gap from a business perspective. And that started in June, July. And now we're at the end, and it was a 6-month process, and we're where we're at now. So it's sort of, it was fairly quick, I would say, between March and June.
Mm-hmm.
But it had a lot to do with I just can't sit around and wait for things to get better. I'd rather sort of make them better. And it created...
That's like one of the key moments, I think, in the whole process that you described, is the moment where you decide, we're not going to be in this, we'll just defer and then keep deferring, because actually what that does is it keeps you in the kind of paradigm of, well, really, it's just the same, but we're just going to have to shift it along. The moment you took control of the timing and said, well, I don't know when this is going to end, and therefore let's just put off indefinitely. Suddenly you had the mind really to look way beyond, I think, what you previously have been doing. That seems like it released a lot of creative effort.
And I think also one more thing is that this isn't your standard average crisis. Okay, no. This isn't even 2008-9. Okay, the subprime. I mean, this is World War II, World War I style crisis, and thinking that you're going to go back to what it was just doesn't actually mirror any reality that has ever happened. There is no normal. There will be a new normal. So if we're going into the unknown and we don't know what it is, so we can take some control by sort of those things that you mentioned, but we also have to understand that our thinking needs to be adapted, and don't just think backwards. Think about what you've got right now. To me, it was important to save the staff.
Sure.
To me, it was important to keep the people, because this is really an expertise to brand and market a place. And my staff has that expertise. And so I didn't want to lose them. Yeah. And so for me, keeping them was an important part of the ability of the organization to thrive and not just to survive. So those are aspects that also, that people compared it initially to the subprime mortgage crisis.
Right, and then they understand meaningfully different.
This isn't really a health issue. This is an economic crisis of, proportions that we have never seen.
Right, and I think relevant also to your work, it's going to be socially very disruptive as well. People's habits, the way they actually do things. I think it's going to take a long time before, we really do know what the future looks like. It does sound like that in Vibe and yourself, we've got some people who are thinking beyond and outside that box. So that's pretty exciting. And we've covered a tremendous amount of stuff. It's been really interesting for me. Maybe as we sort of move out of the crisis and we see you see how some of those things start to develop, it'd be great to have you back and sort of hear a little bit more. In the meantime, just to say thank you. And thank you, everybody who's been watching today's podcast. And if you've got any questions, please do send them in, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.